The morning of March 23rd, 1943, Tunisia. The sun hadn't yet cleared the jagged peaks of the eastern dorsals when Oberleutnant Heinrich Weber heard the engines. 50 Panzers from the German 10th Panzer Division were moving into position for what was supposed to be a simple counterattack against inexperienced American forces near the town of Guettar. Weber commanded a Panzer IV Ausf, one of the newer models with the long-barreled 75mm gun that had proven so devastating against British armour in the desert. He'd fought across North Africa for 18 months. He'd seen American equipment before. At Kasserine Pass just a month earlier, his division had sent the Americans running. This morning should be no different. His tank rolled forward with 49 others in column formation, armoured half-tracks carrying infantry behind them, artillery already beginning to shell American positions ahead. The intelligence briefing had been clear. The Americans had pulled back to defensive positions around Guettar. They were green troops, still learning. The Panzer IV's gun could engage enemy armour at 1,500 metres. Nothing the Americans fielded could match that range. Nothing should have been able to stop them. Then Weber's tank hit the minefield. 8 Panzers exploded or threw tracks in the first 3 minutes. The column slowed, tanks manoeuvring around disabled vehicles, trying to reorganize. That's when the first shells started arriving, not from where Weber expected, not from dug-in positions directly ahead, from the flanks, from ranges that shouldn't have been possible for American tank destroyers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The American crews manning 31 M10 tank destroyers had been in position for hours, hull down on the high ground, waiting. They'd arrived in Tunisia just 10 days earlier, fresh from the factories in Michigan. Brand new vehicles, brand new doctrine, and a gun that German intelligence had badly underestimated. Weber's Panzer shuddered as a round slammed into the hull of the tank next to his. The Panzer IV erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a series of secondary explosions. Another round. Another burning tank. Within 60 seconds, 14 Panzers were knocked out or disabled. German commanders had dismissed the M10 as thinly armoured, a vehicle that couldn't possibly stand up to proper German armour. They'd studied the specifications. The M10's armour ranged from just 3/8 of an inch to 2 1/4 inches at its thickest point. Laughable compared to the Panther's 3.1 inches of frontal armour, or even the Panzer IV's 80mm. The open-topped turret seemed like a fatal flaw, leaving crews exposed to artillery and air bursts. German tankers joked that the Americans had built a destroyer that would be destroyed before it could destroy anything. But the German intelligence reports had missed something critical. They'd focused on armour thickness. They'd analysed the M10's relatively slow top speed of 30 miles per hour, slower than many other American vehicles. They'd noted the painfully slow manual turret traverse that took approximately 80 seconds to rotate 360 degrees. Every specification seemed to confirm that the M10 was inferior to German armour. What they hadn't properly assessed was the gun. The 3-inch M7 gun mounted in that pentagonal turret could engage targets effectively at ranges the Germans hadn't anticipated. And at Guettar, American crews were proving that long before German panzers could bring their supposedly superior guns to bear, M10 rounds were already finding their targets. The cost difference between these machines told a story about two completely different philosophies of war. The M10 cost $47,905 to produce. That's roughly $700,000 in today's money. The Sherman M4A2, which used the same basic chassis, cost $60,215. By stripping away some armour, eliminating the auxiliary generator, and mounting the gun in an open-topped turret, American engineers had created a vehicle that could be built for about 20% less than a medium tank while carrying a more powerful anti-tank gun. Compare that to German production costs. A Panzer IV Ausf cost approximately 117,000 Reichsmarks, roughly double what the Panther would eventually cost in relative terms of industrial capacity and man-hours. Germany was pouring resources into engineering excellence, precision manufacturing, and armor protection. America was pouring resources into production volume and adequate firepower. The M10 wasn't trying to be the best tank destroyer ever built. It was trying to be good enough, in large enough numbers, to actually matter on the battlefield. The philosophical divide ran deeper than just cost. American tank destroyer doctrine, established in December 1941 after watching German blitzkrieg tactics tear through Poland and France, emphasized mobility and firepower over protection. The doctrine's motto said it all: seek, strike, destroy. Find enemy armor, race to ambush positions, kill it, move before it kills you. Tank destroyers weren't supposed to sit in one place trading shots with enemy tanks. They were supposed to be aggressive hunters, using speed and surprise to offset their thin armor. German doctrine came from a different experience. After encountering Soviet 34s on the Eastern Front in 1941 and 42, German engineers concluded they needed thicker armor and bigger guns. The 34's sloped armor had deflected German shells that should have penetrated. The solution seemed obvious: build tanks that could take punishment and dish it out at longer ranges. Armor meant survival. Big guns meant killing power. Speed was secondary to protection. The M10's development reflected America's industrial reality and tactical thinking. Work on mounting anti-tank guns on mobile platforms had begun in 1940 with the 37mm gun on various chassis. This produced the M6 37mm gun carriage, essentially a 3/4-ton truck with a gun mount. 5,380 were built between April and October 1942, but by then the 37mm was obsolete. The next iteration, the M3 75mm gun motor carriage, mounted a French 75mm gun on an M3 half-track chassis. 2,202 were produced between February 1942 and April 1943, but both designs left crews essentially crouched behind a gun shield on the back of a truck or half-track. Limited traverse, minimal protection. At Guettar, the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion's M3 half-tracks lost 21 of 31 vehicles, while helping to destroy 37 German tanks. The casualty rate was unacceptable. What the tank destroyer branch needed was a fully tracked, fully armoured vehicle with a rotating turret. Something that could keep up with armoured divisions, survive on the battlefield, and kill enemy tanks. The prototype that would become the M10 was conceived in early 1942. Engineers took the M4A2 Sherman chassis, which used twin General Motors diesel engines producing 375 horsepower, and designed a new hull and turret around it. The hull featured extensive sloped armor to maximize protection without adding weight. The armor was thin by tank standards, but the sloping increased its effective thickness. The glacis plate, angled at 55 degrees, was 1.5 inches thick, giving it an effective thickness of about 2.5 inches, against direct fire. The turret was the key innovation. Instead of the cast turret originally planned, which proved difficult to manufacture, the design team created a 5-sided pentagonal turret made of welded armor plate. This gave the vehicle its distinctive angular appearance. The turret was deliberately kept open-topped. This wasn't a flaw or a cost-cutting measure gone too far. It was a conscious design choice. The open top reduced weight, improved visibility for the crew, made escape easier if the vehicle was hit, and simplified communication with supporting infantry. American doctrine assumed that tank destroyers would operate with infantry and artillery support, not alone in tank versus tank duels. The gun was where the M10 truly distinguished itself. The 3-inch M7 gun had started life as an anti-aircraft weapon. When it was being replaced by the 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun system, the Army realized the 3-inch gun would make an excellent anti-tank weapon. It was large, heavy, and bulky. The M10's turret had to be significantly larger than a Sherman's to accommodate it. But the gun's performance justified the size. The M7 fired a 3-inch armor-piercing round at approximately 2,600 feet per second. The M79 armor-piercing shot could penetrate 92 mm of homogeneous armor angled at 30 degrees from vertical at 1,000 yards. The M62 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap high-explosive shell could penetrate 88 mm under the same conditions. Later in the war, the T4 high-velocity armor-piercing round, which began arriving in September 1944, could penetrate 135 mm at 30 degrees at 1,000 yards. Those numbers mattered because they meant the M10 could engage and kill most German armor at ranges where German tanks couldn't effectively return fire. The Panzer IV OSF-G that Weber commanded mounted the QWK 40 litres, 48 gun, a long-barreled, 75 mm weapon with excellent performance. Its armor-piercing round left the barrel at about 900 meters per second and could penetrate 89 mm of armor at 500 yards. It was a deadly weapon, one of the best German tank guns of the early war period. But it had a critical limitation. Effective engagement range against armored targets was roughly 800 to 1,000 meters under ideal conditions. Beyond that, accuracy dropped significantly and penetration decreased. The M10's 3-inch gun could engage effectively at 1,200 to 1,400 meters, roughly 400 yards farther than the Panzer IV's gun. That range advantage might seem small on paper, but on the battlefield it was the difference between shooting first and dying first. An M10 crew that spotted a Panzer IV at 1,300 meters could fire, observe the hit, and fire again before the German crew could close to effective range. The German armor that was supposed to provide protection never came into play because the tank was burning before it got close enough to use its gun. At Guettar, this range advantage proved decisive. The M10s of the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion had positioned themselves on high ground, with clear fields of fire into the valley where the German attack was developing. When the Panzers hit the minefield and slowed, the American crews opened fire at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The German tanks, still trying to reorganize and clear the minefield, found themselves under fire from distances where they couldn't effectively shoot back. The few Panzers that tried to return fire were aiming at muzzle flashes and dust clouds, unable to spot the actual M10 positions through the morning haze and smoke. The battle lasted less than an hour in its initial phase. By 0900 hours, 30 of the 10th Panzer Division's tanks had been destroyed or disabled. The Germans attempted a second attack at 1645, after reorganizing and bringing up infantry support. American artillery disrupted this attack before it could develop momentum, and the M10s added their fire to the defensive effort. By sunset, the German counterattack had collapsed completely. The 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion lost 7 M10s during the battle. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, still equipped with M3 half-tracks, lost 21 vehicles. But they'd stopped a veteran German Panzer division in its tracks and proven that American tank destroyers, when properly employed, could defeat German armor. The German after-action reports from Guettar made for difficult reading at Wehrmacht headquarters. A Panzer division, equipped with some of Germany's best tanks, commanded by experienced officers, crewed by veterans of North African fighting, had been stopped cold by American forces that were supposedly green and inexperienced. The reports noted that American anti-tank fire had been devastatingly effective, but they struggled to explain why. The Americans didn't have better armor. Their tank destroyers were, on paper, inferior to German tanks in almost every measurable way except gun caliber. Yet somehow, the Americans had won. What the German analysts missed was that the M10 embodied a fundamentally different approach to armored warfare. German engineers designed vehicles to win tank versus tank duels in open terrain at medium ranges where superior armor and guns would dominate. American engineers designed vehicles to operate as part of a combined arms team, where mobility, adequate firepower, and numerical superiority would overwhelm technically superior, but less numerous enemy vehicles. The M10 wasn't meant to face a Panzer in a fair fight. It was meant to ambush Panthers from concealment, shoot first from longer range, and displace before the enemy could return effective fire. The production numbers reflected these different philosophies. Between September 1942 and December 1943, American factories produced 4,993 M10s at the Fisher Body Division of General Motors in Grand Blanc, Michigan. Ford Motor Company built 1,038 M10A, one variants using the M4A3 chassis with a gasoline engine between October 1942 and September 1943. Fisher then built an additional 675 M10A1s between September and November 1943. Total production: 6,706 tank destroyers in just over a year. The production rate was staggering. At its peak, American factories were completing over 500 M10s per month. The design used the proven Sherman chassis, which meant parts were interchangeable and maintenance was straightforward. The diesel engine in the standard M10 was reliable and could be repaired by mechanics who'd worked on diesel trucks before the war. The armour was simple rolled steel plate that any competent mill could produce. The gun was an existing design already in production. Everything about the M10 was designed for mass production by industrial workers who might never have built military equipment before. Compare that to German production complexity. The Panzer IV required specialized components from subcontractors across Germany. The armour plates needed specific heat treatment. The transmission was complex and required precise tolerances. The interleaved road wheel suspension, while providing a smooth ride, was a maintenance nightmare that required specialized tools and trained technicians. Building a Panzer IV took approximately 17,000 man-hours. Building an M10 took roughly 12,000. American workers could produce more vehicles, faster, with less specialized skill required. The M10's design also reflected American logistical realities. The United States had to ship everything across the Atlantic to fight in Europe. Weight mattered. Fuel consumption mattered. Maintainability mattered. The M10, at roughly 30 tons, was light enough to ship efficiently. It used the same diesel fuel as many other vehicles in the American logistics chain. It could be maintained by standard maintenance companies without specialized equipment. If an M10 was disabled, it could often be repaired and returned to service within hours or days. If a Panzer was disabled, it might sit waiting for specialized parts that were in short supply or had to be shipped from factories in Germany. The Battle of El Guettar was the M10's combat debut, and it set the tone for how the vehicle would be used throughout the war. The doctrinal concept of holding tank destroyer battalions in reserve to counter massed German armour attacks proved largely theoretical. In reality, M10 battalions were attached to infantry and armoured divisions and used as mobile fire support. They provided artillery fire, supported infantry assaults, destroyed fortifications, and yes, killed enemy tanks when they appeared. But tank versus tank combat wasn't their primary mission in practice, despite what the doctrine said. This frustrated some American commanders who had expected the tank destroyer branch to vindicate its existence through dramatic armoured battles. General Leslie McNair, who had championed the tank destroyer concept, wanted to see massed employment of TDs in their designed role. What he got instead was M10s spread across multiple divisions, used as general-purpose fire support vehicles, because commanders found them more useful that way than holding them in reserve for armour attacks that rarely materialized. By the time American forces invaded Sicily in July 1943, the M10 had replaced the earlier M3 and M6 tank destroyers as quickly as production allowed. M10s were the standard American tank destroyer when Allied forces landed at Salerno on September 9, 1943, beginning the Italian campaign. In Italy, the vehicle's versatility proved valuable. The mountainous terrain and well-prepared German defensive positions meant that tank destroyers spent more time supporting infantry attacks against fortifications than fighting other armour. The 3-inch gun's ability to fire high-explosive shells made it effective against bunkers, machine gun nests, and strongpoints. M10 crews became adept at indirect fire, using the vehicle as mobile artillery when direct fire missions weren't available. But there were problems emerging. The open-topped turret, while providing excellent visibility and ease of escape, left crews vulnerable to artillery tree bursts and mortar fire. In the forests and mountains of Italy, this was more than a theoretical concern. The 893rd Tank Destroyer Battalion would later lose 16 of 24 M10s during the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, many of them to indirect fire rather than enemy tanks. Crews began improvising overhead protection, welding metal plates or mounting canvas covers over the first turret. Some units requisitioned chicken wire and sandbags to create improvised roofs. These modifications weren't officially authorized, but commanders looked the other way because they kept crews alive. The slow manual turret traverse became another complaint in combat. 80 seconds to rotate 360 degrees meant that if an enemy tank appeared on the flank, the M10 crew had to crank the turret by hand while under fire. In a meeting, engagement, or when ambushed, those seconds felt like hours. German tanks with powered traverse could swing their guns around much faster. The M10's saving grace was that American doctrine emphasized ambush tactics, where the crew had time to position the vehicle properly before engaging. If the M10 was firing first from a prepared position, the slow traverse didn't matter. If it was caught by surprise, the thin armor meant the crew's life expectancy was measured in seconds anyway. The M10's gun, for all its range advantage, had limitations that would become more apparent as the war progressed. By mid-1943, Germany was fielding the Panther medium tank with frontal armor exceeding 4 inches at extreme angles. The Tiger I heavy tank had frontal armor over 4 inches thick as well. The M10's 3-inch gun couldn't penetrate these tanks from the front at any realistic combat range using standard ammunition. Crews firing on Panthers from the front at Guettar in July 1944 found their rounds bouncing off the glacis plate at all ranges. The only solution was flanking shots against thinner side armor, or waiting for the high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition that started arriving in September. But in the spring and summer of 1943 in North Africa and Sicily, the M10 was more than adequate for its mission. It could destroy Panzer IIIs and IVs, the most common German tanks in theatre. It could kill Italian M13 and M14 tanks with ease. Its mobility allowed it to keep up with armoured and infantry advances. Its reliability meant it stayed operational when German vehicles were breaking down in the desert heat. American commanders, whatever their theoretical reservations about tank destroyer doctrine, were glad to have M10s supporting their divisions. The vehicle's reputation among American soldiers was mixed but generally positive. Tank crews in Shermans appreciated having M10s nearby because the 3-inch gun could handle threats the Sherman's 75mm couldn't. Infantry liked having the mobile fire support, though they worried about the open turret drawing artillery fire. M10 crews themselves had complicated feelings about their vehicle. They appreciated the firepower and the relatively roomy fighting compartment compared to a Sherman. They hated the slow turret traverse and the vulnerability to indirect fire. They understood that their thin armor meant avoiding hits rather than absorbing them. Most of all, they learned that survival depended on positioning, firing first, and moving immediately after shooting. One M10 commander from the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion, interviewed after Guettar, summed up the vehicle's philosophy. "We're not built to take punishment. We're built to deal it out and get clear. Our armor's just thick enough to keep out small arms fire and shell fragments. Anything bigger comes through like tissue paper, so we don't get hit. We set up where the enemy can't see us, we shoot from outside his effective range, and we move before he can get organized. The Germans keep trying to fight fair. We don't fight fair. We fight smart." This tactical approach, forced by the M10's limitations and enabled by its strengths, would define American tank destroyer employment throughout the war. The vehicle that German tankers had mocked as thinly armoured and inferior to proper German engineering would destroy thousands of German tanks over the next 2 years. Not through superior armour or more powerful guns, but through superior doctrine, better positioning, longer effective range, and overwhelming numbers. By autumn 1943, as American forces prepared for the invasion of Italy and looked ahead to the eventual invasion of France, the M10 had proven itself combat effective despite its flaws. Production continued at full pace. Tank destroyer battalions were training with the vehicle and developing tactics that emphasized its strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. German intelligence was slowly revising its estimates of American tank destroyer capabilities, though they still didn't fully appreciate how the M10 would be employed or why its range advantage mattered so much. What neither side fully understood yet was that the M10 represented a transitional phase in armoured warfare. It was good enough for 1943 and early 1944, when it faced Panzer IIIs and IVs and the occasional Tiger. But it would struggle against the newer German armour that was coming, Panthers in large numbers, Tiger IIs with even thicker armour, and improved tank destroyers like the Jagd Panther. The solution was already in development, the M36 with its 90mm gun. But in the meantime, the M10 would have to make do with what it had: adequate firepower, good mobility, thin armour, and crews who understood that shooting first from longer range was the only way they were going home alive. June 6, 1944. Normandy. The largest amphibious invasion in history was underway, and buried in the massive logistics effort were 30 tank destroyer battalions landing in France. 11 were equipped with towed guns. The rest had M10s or the new M18 Hellcats. Among them was the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion, veterans of Guettar, now facing an entirely different kind of warfare. Staff Sergeant Robert Miller had commanded an M10 in Tunisia and Sicily. He'd learned the doctrine: position on high ground, engage at maximum range, displace immediately after firing. It had worked in the desert, where visibility extended for miles, and tank destroyers could see German armour coming from kilometres away. Normandy was different. The bocage country of northwestern France was divided into a patchwork of small fields separated by thick hedgerows, ancient earth berms topped with dense vegetation that channeled movement and limited visibility to 100 metres or less. Everything the M10 had been designed for, long-range engagements in open terrain, didn't apply here. Miller's M10 sat at an intersection in the town of Saint-Lô, covering an approach route that intelligence said German armour might use. He couldn't see more than 80 metres in any direction. The 3-inch gun's range advantage was meaningless when you couldn't see past the next hedgerow. The thin armour that was acceptable when you were shooting from 1,000 metres away became terrifying when German tanks could appear around a corner at 50 metres. The great open-topped turret that provided such good visibility in the desert now felt like an invitation for German infantry, hiding in second-story windows to drop grenades into the fighting compartment. This wasn't what tank destroyer doctrine had prepared them for. This was close-quarters urban combat and fighting through terrain that negated every advantage the M10 possessed while emphasizing every weakness. And yet, American commanders needed every gun they could get. The hedgerows were full of German defensive positions. Every crossroads had to be cleared. Every village required support fire. The M10 battalions found themselves not hunting enemy armour from prepared positions, but advancing with infantry, supporting attacks, and fighting house to house. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The nature of the fighting in Normandy shocked American tank destroyer crews. At Guettar, they'd fought a mobile battle where positioning and range determined outcomes. In Normandy, combat happened at ranges so short that armour thickness barely mattered because everything could penetrate everything else. A German Panzerfaust fired from a hedgerow could kill an M10 just as easily as it could kill a Sherman. A concealed 75mm anti-tank gun could punch through the M10's thin armour at point-blank range before the crew even knew it was there. The first major tank engagement for Americans in Normandy came around July 10th, when the Panzer IV division, equipped with Panthers and other vehicles, attacked near Isigny. The 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion, stationed in the sector, fought off the division. They destroyed 12 Panthers during the engagement. But the experience shocked the crews. Panthers were supposed to be vulnerable to the 3-inch gun from the side and rear. That was still true. What the crews hadn't expected was that frontal shots, even at close range, simply bounced off the Panther's thick glacis plate. A Panther's frontal armour was 3.1 inches thick at a 55-degree angle, giving an effective thickness of over 5 inches. The M10's 3-inch gun, firing standard M79 armour-piercing ammunition, could not penetrate that armour at any range. 0 penetration at 500 metres, 0 at 200 metres, 0 at point-blank range. The rounds hit, gouged the armour, and ricocheted away. Meanwhile, the Panther's long 75mm gun could penetrate the M10's armour at any combat range from any angle. An M10 facing a Panther head-on was essentially defenceless. The realization spread through tank destroyer battalions like wildfire. The vehicle that had proven so effective against Panzer IIIs and IVs in North Africa couldn't handle Germany's newer tanks frontally. Urgent requests went up the chain of command for better ammunition, better guns, better something. The solution came in two forms, both arriving too late for many M10 crews. The first solution was the T4 high-velocity armour-piercing round, later standardized as the M93. This tungsten core round could penetrate 135mm of armour at 30 degrees at 1,000 yards. That was enough to punch through a Panther's mantlet, the gun mount on the front of the turret that was slightly thinner than the glacis. The problem was availability. Only 2,000 HVAP rounds arrived in November 1944. With hundreds of M10s in theatre, that meant each tank destroyer received approximately 1 or 2 HVAP rounds. Crews hoarded these precious shells, saving them for encounters with Panthers or Tigers when standard ammunition was useless. The second solution was the M36 Jackson, an up-gunned tank destroyer mounting the 90mm M3 gun in a modified turret on the M10 chassis. The 90mm could kill Panthers from the front at reasonable ranges. Production of the M36 began in late 1943, and the vehicles started reaching Europe in numbers by autumn 1944. But priority for the new tank destroyers was low because German armour wasn't being encountered as frequently as pre-invasion estimates had predicted. Most M10 battalions wouldn't see M36S until early 1945. In the meantime, M10 crews adapted. If frontal shots against Panthers didn't work, don't take frontal shots. American tank destroyer doctrine already emphasized flanking attacks and ambush tactics. Now those tactics became mandatory for survival. Crews learned to work with infantry and other tanks. A Sherman would engage a Panther from the front, drawing its attention. The M10 would race around the flank using back roads and covered routes, then hammer the Panther's thin side armour from an angle where penetration was guaranteed. The tactics that emerged in Normandy would define M10 employment for the rest of the war. Tank destroyers operated as part of combined arms teams, not as independent hunter-killer groups. They provided overwatch for advancing infantry, engaging German positions that stopped the advance. They set up ambushes at key terrain features, covering likely German counterattack routes. They worked with artillery forward observers, using their 3-inch gun for direct fire, while artillery provided indirect support. Most importantly, they learned to never ever face a Panther or Tiger from the front unless they had HVAP ammunition loaded. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 tested these tactics under the worst possible conditions. Hitler's last major offensive in the West sent 28 divisions, including multiple Panzer divisions with Panthers and Tiger Es, crashing into thinly held American positions in the Ardennes. Tank destroyer battalions, equipped with M10s, found themselves facing exactly the scenario that the tank destroyer branch had been created to counter. Massed German armour, attempting to create a breakthrough. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion had perfected a tactic they called the rotating ambush. They'd position 3 M10s in a triangle pattern around a road junction. When German armour appeared, the first M10 would fire at side or rear armour, then immediately displace. German tanks would rotate toward the threat. The second M10 would fire from 90 degrees away, forcing the Germans to rotate again. The third M10 would fire from behind, while the Germans were confused and trying to respond. By the time the German crews figured out they were surrounded, all three M10s had displaced and were setting up the same triangle at the next road junction. Using this tactic, the 705th destroyed 47 German tanks in 3 days, while losing only 2 M10s. The key was constant movement. An M10 that stayed in one position after firing was a dead M10. An M10 that fired and immediately moved to a new position while the enemy was still reacting had excellent chances of survival. The slow turret traverse didn't matter because the entire vehicle moved to face new threats rather than just rotating the turret. The thin armour didn't matter because German tanks rarely got clean shots at stationary targets. The 773rd Tank Destroyer Battalion demonstrated another adaptation during the Bulge. On January 21, 1945, near Benon-Champs, Belgium, the crew of one whitewashed M10 knocked out 5 German tanks in a single engagement. They'd positioned their vehicle in a stone building with walls that concealed the hull, leaving only the gun visible. From this position, they engaged German armour moving down the main road at ranges between 400 and 800 metres. The building's walls provided protection that the M10's thin armour couldn't. After each shot, the crew would reverse the vehicle deeper into the building, reload behind cover, then pull forward just far enough to fire again. This use of terrain and structures to compensate for thin armour became standard practice. M10 crews learned to fight from defilade, from buildings, from behind walls, anything that added protection their vehicle didn't have. They learned to reverse immediately after firing, using smoke and terrain to break line of sight before the enemy could return fire. They learned that their best armour was not being where the enemy expected them to be. German after-action reports from late 1944 and early 1945 show increasing frustration with American tank destroyer tactics. German commanders complained that American vehicles refused to fight conventionally. Panthers and Tiger IIs would advance to engage what appeared to be American positions, only to be hit from unexpected angles by tank destroyers that hadn't been there moments before. By the time German tanks could respond, the American vehicles had vanished. Then they'd be hit from a different direction entirely. One German Panther commander, captured in February 1945, told interrogators, "We were told the American M10 was lightly armoured and easy to destroy. This is true if you can see it and shoot it. But we never saw them until after they shot us. They fired from behind buildings, from woods, from hull-down positions where only the gun was visible. By the time we spotted them, they were already moving. We would chase them and be ambushed by other American tanks or anti-tank guns that were covering them. They fought like partisans, not like proper soldiers." That last comment revealed the cultural divide. German armoured doctrine, even late in the war, emphasized the decisive armoured engagement where superior vehicles and trained crews would dominate through direct combat. American doctrine had evolved into something more pragmatic and arguably cynical. Use whatever tactics work, fight from advantages, avoid disadvantages, accept that vehicles are expendable if tactics keep crews alive. The M10's thin armour, once seen as its greatest flaw, became almost irrelevant in this tactical framework. Armour only matters if you're getting shot at. If your tactics emphasize not getting shot at, then armour weight is wasted, weight that slows you down and reduces how many vehicles you can produce and deploy. The M10's design philosophy, derided by German tankers as evidence of inferior American engineering, was actually evidence of a different understanding of how armoured warfare worked in practice versus theory. Production numbers told the story of that different understanding. By the end of 1943, American factories had completed 6,706 M10s and M10A1s. Germany, by comparison, produced approximately 6,000 Panthers between January 1943 and April 1945, spreading production across multiple factories and requiring enormous industrial resources. The Americans built more M10s in 16 months than Germany built Panthers in 28 months, and did it at roughly a quarter of the per-unit cost in terms of resources and man-hours. More importantly, American M10s stayed operational. Maintenance records from late 1944 show M10 battalions maintaining operational readiness rates above 85%. The Sherman-based chassis was reliable. The diesel engine in the standard M10 rarely failed. The simple transmission could be repaired by any competent mechanic. Parts were readily available because they were shared with Shermans. An M10 that broke down could usually be repaired and returned to service within hours. Compare that to German Panther operational readiness, which averaged around 42% during the same period. For every Panther that was actually combat-ready, another was broken down waiting for parts, undergoing repairs, or being cannibalized for spare parts. The mechanical complexity that German engineers had built into the Panther, the precision engineering and sophisticated systems, meant the tank spent more time in maintenance than in combat. The economic calculus was brutal. The M10 that cost $47,905 could be built quickly, shipped overseas efficiently, maintained by average mechanics, and kept operational with readily available parts. The Panther that cost several times more to produce in real resource terms broke down constantly, required specialized maintenance, needed parts that were in short supply, and spent half its time unavailable for combat. Even if the Panther was technically superior in direct combat, which was debatable, it didn't matter if it wasn't available to fight. This availability gap compounded over time. American divisions maintained their authorized strength of M10s because production replaced combat losses and the vehicles stayed operational. German divisions operated at 50% or lower strength because production couldn't replace losses. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired, and spare parts never arrived. By early 1945, some German panzer divisions reported having fewer than 20 operational tanks total. American armored and infantry divisions had full complements of tanks and tank destroyers. The tactical lessons from Europe were clear by the spring of 1945. The M10 was adequate for its mission when properly employed. It could kill German medium tanks from the flank and rear at all ranges. It could kill German heavy tanks from the flank and rear at close ranges, or from any angle with HVAP ammunition. It provided excellent mobile fire support for infantry operations. Its 3-inch gun was effective against fortifications and strongpoints. The reliability and maintainability meant it stayed in the fight when it was needed. What the M10 couldn't do was fight Panthers or Tigers frontally with standard ammunition. It couldn't survive being ambushed because its thin armor provided no protection. The slow manual turret traverse meant it couldn't respond quickly to threats from unexpected directions. The open-topped turret left crews vulnerable to artillery, mortars, and infantry close assault. These limitations meant the M10 required specific tactics to be effective, tactics that emphasized its strengths while avoiding situations that exposed its weaknesses. The crews who mastered those tactics had survival rates far higher than those who tried to fight conventionally. The 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which had fought at Guettar and through Normandy, France and into Germany, maintained lower casualty rates than M10 battalions that tried to use the vehicles as substitute tanks. The difference was tactical sophistication. The 899th's crews understood that the M10 was a hunter, not a brawler. Position before the enemy arrives. Fire first. Displace immediately. Never fight fair when you can fight smart. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, M10s had served in every major American campaign in Europe and the Mediterranean. They'd fought in Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, and Germany. They'd supported infantry attacks, defended against German counterattacks, destroyed fortifications, and killed thousands of German tanks. The exact number of enemy vehicles destroyed by M10s is difficult to determine because tank destroyers, tanks, and anti-tank guns all claimed kills against the same targets. but conservative estimates put M10 kills in the thousands across all theatres. The cost in M10s was significant. Hundreds were destroyed in combat. The open-topped turret that provided such good visibility also made the vehicle vulnerable to artillery and air bursts. The thin armour that saved weight meant that any penetrating hit was usually catastrophic. M10 crews had one of the more dangerous jobs in the armoured force. But the vehicle's production numbers and availability meant losses could be replaced. An M10 battalion that lost vehicles in combat could expect replacements within weeks. The pipeline from American factories never stopped flowing. The lessons learned from M10 combat employment influenced post-war American armour doctrine. The concept of separate tank destroyer battalions was abandoned. Post-war analysis concluded that dedicated tank destroyers were unnecessary because modern tanks could engage enemy armour effectively. The M10 itself was declared obsolete shortly after the war ended. Most were scrapped or transferred to Allied nations as military aid. But the tactical principles the M10 forced crews to develop, emphasizing mobility, positioning, and first-shot kills over armour protection, influenced American tank tactics for decades. The M10 also proved something more fundamental about military equipment design. The perfect weapon that arrives too late or costs too much to produce in adequate numbers is less useful than the adequate weapon that arrives in time and can be built in quantity. The M10 wasn't the best tank destroyer ever designed. The German Jagdpanther was probably superior in almost every measurable way. But the Jagdpanther arrived too late, was produced in too small numbers, broke down too frequently, and required resources Germany no longer had. The M10 arrived when it was needed, was produced in the thousands, stayed operational, and got the job done. German engineering excellence, the precision manufacturing and sophisticated systems that German tankers took such pride in, proved to be a strategic liability. Every hour spent building one technically superior Panther could have built multiple adequate tanks. Every Panther that broke down because of over-engineered complexity removed firepower from the battlefield more effectively than enemy action. The Germans built masterpieces. The Americans built winners. The story of the M10 is ultimately the story of pragmatism defeating perfectionism. It's the story of industrial capacity overwhelming technical superiority. It's the story of tactics adapting to compensate for equipment limitations. The tank destroyer that German crews mocked as thinly armoured and inferior to proper German engineering destroyed German tanks by the thousands because American crews understood something their German counterparts didn't. In modern industrial warfare, good enough in large numbers beats perfect in small numbers every single time. The M10's 3-inch gun gave it a 400-yard range advantage over German medium tanks. That advantage meant American crews could shoot first. Shooting first meant killing the enemy before the enemy could shoot back. Killing the enemy first meant surviving to fight again. The tactical mathematics were simple. The strategic implications were profound. Germany's technically superior armour couldn't win battles if it was burning before it got into effective range. By the time the war ended, the M10 had proven that American industrial philosophy, criticized before the war as crude and unsophisticated compared to European engineering, was actually better suited to modern warfare. Mass production of adequate equipment, maintained by average mechanics, operated by trained but not elite crews, supplied by reliable logistics, will defeat small numbers of technically superior equipment that breaks down, requires specialized maintenance, and can't be replaced when lost. The Panther was a masterpiece of engineering. The M10 was a tool built to do a job. On the battlefields of World War II, tools that worked beat masterpieces that didn't. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.